Hey, welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. We are looking in the Old Testament at some men and women who we can learn from about faith. This is our seventh installment of what I'm calling the Hall of Faith, and that is from Hebrews 11, is often called the Hall of Faith. So this is Abraham and Sarah's story, and it's actually the third week of that. Last couple of times, we did look at the faith of Abraham and Sarah, inspired by the words from Hebrews chapter 11. So in verses 8 through 10, we read, by faith, Abraham, he obeyed and went. And then that was a couple of weeks ago. Last week in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 11 and 12, we looked at by faith, Sarah took God's promise seriously and in her old age conceived what was to be Isaac. I'm paraphrasing them those. Isaac is the beginning of the fulfillment of God's promise. So now we come to a third example of Abraham's faith. Let's read about it in Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 17. Hebrews 11:17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Okay, this is a story I would venture to say we've all heard. Abraham is asked by God to sacrifice his son. We'll go through the story in Genesis very shortly, but let's first look at the words, God tested him, in verse 17. God tested him. God tested Abraham. God tests you and me. Throughout our lives, he tests us. There's a benefit to being tested. I want to quote or paraphrase the words of Chuck Swindoll. He writes, there's something about the results of God's test that forces us to come to grips with the condition of our faith. We may be able to fake it in the pew or at prayer meetings, but God's strenuous testing shows our faith for what it is. And then Chuck later adds, these tests are not designed only to reveal the weakness of our faith, they are designed to strengthen it as well. So that's a benefit, a strengthening of our faith. Not all tests in life are the same, though. If you look at Paul's words in Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and I got this idea through Chuck also, he points out 4 levels of testing that we all run into. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 8 and 9 says, this is talking to the Corinthians, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. So using this as our guide, the first kind of test, the most moderate, is there in verse 8. So we, you and I, are hard pressed on every side. Other translations are, we are troubled, or we are afflicted. All these translations suggest pressure. These are tests that come from people, they come from deadlines, from irritations, from interruptions. It just seems to be part of everyday life. So we are hard pressed on every side. The second level is being perplexed. The Greek term here means without a way. It suggests confusion. It suggests not knowing where to go or who to turn to. This is when ordinary pressures intensify. As an example, we may be subjected to unfair treatment by unfair people, or events where it's difficult to make sense of it all. So that's being perplexed. The third level is persecution, persecuted, coming from the term meaning to run after, to pursue. This is a more extreme test. What comes to mind is running away from a pit bull at your heels when you think of to run after, to pursue. It isn't always physical persecution either. It can be emotional, financial, social, or spiritual. And then we come to the fourth level, the most extreme level of tests, and that is, as we saw at the end of verse 9, being struck down. Struck down. This term means to be thrown down, shoved aside, rejected. It's the deepest level. It's the ultimate test. Maybe it's taking away the something which is most precious. something most dear to your heart and my heart. For Abraham, this being struck down, this ultimate test was what? It was the fate of his beloved son. So let's begin reading this event in Genesis chapter 22, the ultimate test for Abraham. Ultimate tests happen to us all, but fortunately not often. Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Look how God refers to Isaac, your son, your only son, whom you love. What God is asking is incredible. Imagine your shock if you were Abraham. The command really makes no sense. How could this compassionate God impose such a cruel test? How could a God who is faithful to his promise now appear to be going back on his promise? God is commanding Abraham to kill the promise, which is Isaac. The writer of Hebrews said it well. Let's look at that again in verse 17 and 18. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises, that's Abraham. Abraham received the promises, was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Shock, disillusionment, you can imagine, sound like a reasonable reaction to a level 4 test, to an ultimate test. But Abraham's response was unquestioning trust. Look at this trust in verse 22, verse 3. That's my dog. Sorry. Hey, Mercy! Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. And the story continues. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkeys while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. That is faith. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Tragic. Abraham was obediently following through with what God directed him to do. He didn't stew about it. He didn't mull it over, postpone it, or try to negotiate. Remember, he left early the next morning. His faith was immediate. His faith also showed confidence. Back in verse 5, Abraham told the servants, that would be he and his son, would come back. So telling your servants they're both going to come back implies that Abraham is trusting and has faith that he will have his son at the end of this experience. Let's look at that seeming contradiction again. His son is dying on one hand and his son carrying on the family line on the other. The writer of Hebrews has an idea of what Abraham, knife in hand, might have been thinking. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17, actually look at just 19. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So we who heard this story know that a raising from the dead wasn't necessary. Because what happened in verse 11 of Genesis 22, the angel of the Lord called out to him, Abraham, from heaven. Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So God's intervention showed that he never had intended Abraham to go through with this sacrifice. It showed that it had been a test. God does know all, right? God knew what Abraham would do. You could really say this was for Abraham's benefit. Abraham needed to see the extent of his own faith. Now both God and Abraham knew that Abraham would hold nothing back, and that Abraham truly feared God, as it says. Now I know that you fear God. Fearing God in the sense that to reverence him as sovereign, to trust him implicitly, to obey him without question. So what a great model Abraham is for living a life of faith. When we encounter our tests through life, let's keep Abraham's faith in mind. And we will continue next week with some Old Testament men and women. In the meantime, take care, and may the Lord be with you.